Transcritique 3.1 Subject and its Tapas. Kant's transcendental critique has been attacked for being a successor to the Cartesian method that constitutes the world by way of the cogito. It is possible to defend Kant against this position by pointing out a number of characteristics that dissociate him from Descartes. But instead of doing this now, I would like to reconsider Descartes himself, who is being nearly unanimously attacked nowadays. In his discourse on method, Descartes speaks autobiographically about the motives behind his overall skepticism. Reading old books, he had learned that discourses on truth vary according to different historical contexts, and by traveling he had learned that truths themselves are the constructs of grammars and customs of communities. He wrote having recognized since then, in traveling, that all those who have sentiments very contrary to ours are not, for that reason, barbarians or savages, but that many of them make use of reason as much as or more than we do, and, having considered how much different one and the same man, with his very same mind, being brought up from his infancy among the French or the Germans, becomes from that which he would be if he had always lived among the Chinese or the cannibals, and how, even down to the very fashions of our clothing, the same thing that pleased us 10 years ago, and that will perhaps please us once again 10 years hence, now seems to us extravagant and ridiculous, so that it is much more custom and example that persuade us than any certain knowledge. And yet the voices of the majority, Kant, are not a proof that be worth anything for truths even a little difficult to discover, because it is much more likely that one man alone had found them than that a whole people had. Having learned, having recognized and having considered all this, I say, I was unable to choose anyone whose opinions might have seemed to me to have to be preferred to those of the others, and I found myself constrained, as it were, to undertake to guide myself by myself. It is commonly said that Descartes was a solipsist who closed off dialogue and sought to secure truth by way of his concept of ego, as is evident in the passage just cited. However, Cartesian doubt begins from his realization that the truths people believe in are simply determined by the example and custom of the community to which they belong, namely, by shared rules and paradigms. That is to say that Descartes had already been observing the world in the manner of a cultural anthropologist. As I pointed out earlier, many post-linguistic turn philosophers reject methods such as his, motivated as they appear to be in introspection, but the reason Descartes himself tended toward introspection in the first place was because his predecessors of the Philosophia Scholastica, whether nominalist or realist, had all thought within the frame of the grammar of the Indo-European language group. In this respect, the Cartesian cogito is nothing if not the awareness that our thought is always already bound by language. In Kant's terminology, this is the transcendental standpoint toward language. The transcendental position is equivalent to bracketing the imagined self-evidence of the empirical consciousness in order to reveal the conditions that constitute it. What is crucial here is that the transcendental standpoint inexorably accompanies a certain kind of subjectivity. According to Wittgenstein, as we have also seen, skepticism is made possible by a language game. It is a part of the game. Certainly, today, beginning from Cartesian doubt is already a language game, but what Descartes doubted originally was the specific game of skepticism that had been dominant since antiquity, as he framed the problem of doubt in Discourse on Method. Not that I were, in order to do this, to imitate the skeptics, who doubt only in order to doubt, and who affect being always undecided, for, on the contrary, my whole plan tended only toward assuring me, and toward casting aside the shifting earth and the sand in order to find the rock or the clay. 2. Certainly, today, this doubt is incorporated into modern philosophy, supporting as it does the philosophy of subjectivity, and isn't precisely such an institutionalized doubt what Wittgenstein sought to undermine? In fact, Wittgenstein, too, called the proper stance from which to inquire about philosophical issues, from the vantage point of language, transcendental. 3. Here it is possible to find Wittgenstein's otherwise concealed change of attitude, though he never spoke of it himself. Meanwhile, many of those who advocate the linguistic turn in the philosophical context, though often invoking Wittgenstein, forget the problematic of a certain cogito that is already inexorably involved in the change of attitude. Let us take up the example of another one of Descartes' major critics, Lévi-Strauss. Speaking of a traditional ethnographer, he criticizes the cogito as follows. Here they are, he says of his contemporaries, and known strangers, non-beings to me since they so wished it, but I detached from them and from everything. What am I? This is what remains for me to seek. Paraphrasing Rousseau, the ethnographer could exclaim as he first sets eyes on his chosen savages, here they are, then, and known strangers, non-beings to me, since I wished it so, and I, detached from them and from everything. What am I? This is what I must find out first. To attain acceptance of oneself in others, one must first deny the self in oneself. To Rousseau we owe the discovery of this principle, the only one on which to base the science of man, yet it was to remain inaccessible and incomprehensible as long as there reigned a philosophy which, taking the cogito as its point of departure, was imprisoned by the hypothetical evidences of the self, and which could aspire to founding a physics only at the expense of founding sociology and even a biology. Descartes believes that he proceeds directly from a man's interiority to the exteriority of the world, without seeing that societies, civilizations, in other words, worlds of men, place themselves between these two extremes. I return momentarily to Descartes, after noting that while Lévi-Strauss does pass Descartes off as a villain here, this move is strategic. His real targets are certain successors of Cartesianism in France, Sartre in particular. On the other hand, Discourse on Method had already been written from the standpoint of an anthropologist. The Cartesian cogito was originally what James Clifford called an anthropological cogito. Writing as an anthropologist, Descartes continues the passage as follows. It is true that, so long as I did nothing but consider the customs of other men, I found there hardly anything of which to assure myself, and that I noticed there almost as much diversity as I had previously done among the opinions of philosophers. So the greatest profit that I derived therefrom was that, seeing many things that, although they seem to us very extravagant and ridiculous, do not cease to be commonly accepted and approved among other great peoples, I learned not to believe too firmly anything of which I had been persuaded only by example and custom, and thus I delivered myself, little by little, from many errors that can obfuscate our natural light and render us less capable of listening to reason. But, after I had spent some years thus studying in the book of the world and trying to acquire some experience, I one day made the resolution to study within myself, too, and to employ all the powers of my mind in choosing the paths that I should follow. In this I succeeded much better, it would seem to me, than if I had never been away, either from my country or from my book. Reading this, it is impossible for us not to associate Descartes with Lévi-Strauss, among the most merciless of his critics. For instance, the retrospective style in Transcritique is in important respects reminiscent of the Discourse on Method. After receiving his degree in philosophy, as he relates his story, Lévi-Strauss chose to go abroad instead of continuing study in France. He had hoped to go to Japan first, but could not. It is likely that he would have gone anywhere that was not the West. In other words, he did not go abroad as an anthropologist, but at this moment, his anthropological inquiry, albeit informal, had already begun moving away from his country and his book. Or, more precisely, this was a commencement less of anthropological research than the continuation of a certain, as yet unnameable, philosophical investigation. Descartes' primary concerns had also not entailed the experience of the plurality of places he traveled, and, for his part, Lévi-Strauss expresses this laconic disclaimer about traveling at the beginning of Transcritique. I hate traveling and explorers, for traveling and exploration simply consume and dissolve difference. By traveling we never encounter the difference or the other who resists our internalization. What Descartes saw in the uncivilized people he encountered were not fascinating, interesting strangers, but the other who rejects empathy à la Rousseau. Lévi-Strauss adds a further claim in Transcritique. The fact that so much effort and expenditure has to be wasted on reaching the object of our studies bestows no value on that aspect of our profession, and should be seen rather as its negative side. The truths that we seek so far afield only become valid when they have been separated from this dross. 6. The truths Lévi-Strauss seeks so far afield, precisely as had Descartes before him, exist only when they have been separated out from the pluralism encountered by traveling and expedition. The ultimate weapon Lévi-Strauss uses against this process is precisely what Descartes' weapon had been: mathematics. Lévi-Strauss acknowledges the existence of universal reason against within the various myths and marriage systems he eventually encounters. If so, the Lévi-Strauss who considered Rousseau to be founder of anthropology, seeing in him the principle, the only one on which to base the science of man, should have quoted Descartes rather than Rousseau, or anybody else. What is more, Lévi-Strauss encountered the same difficulties as had Descartes. The unconscious structure he grasps is a deductive entity, and, for this reason, it has been subjected to innumerable criticisms by positivist anthropologists. For him, contrary to his critics, The last standard upon which to judge the adequacy of hypothetical models lies in whether or not they have a higher explanatory value that is itself consistent, and it is the role of experimentation to examine this value and internal consistency. This is definitely a different method from any that seeks an inductive theorization adduced from the collection of empirical data. To the precise contrary, this is the Cartesian method par excellence, which is hardly limited to or by the natural sciences in the narrow sense. Levi-Strauss's method contributed mightily to an intellectual revolution, the advent of structuralism, very much because he chose to start from the axiomatic operation by transcendentally reducing the empirical consciousness of both the observed and the observer. Michel Serres has maintained that structure should be defined as a sheerly imported concept, namely, from contemporary formal mathematics. Structure as such is achieved only when the Kant formal sets of elements and relations can be extracted by excluding content, and, as he stresses, the structuralist analysis engendered a new methodical spirit and was an important revolution with respect to the question of meaning. But what one must acknowledge precisely here is that the founder of structuralism in this sense was neither Saussure nor Marx, and certainly not Rousseau, but Descartes, for he himself innovated mathematics itself instead of just importing concepts from mathematics to his philosophy. The axiomatism of contemporary mathematics derived not from Euclid's geometry but from Descartes' analytical geometry, which transposed perceptive geometric figures into the coordinate of numbers. This inevitably introduced the problem of real numbers, as distinct from natural numbers, and led to the advent of the post-Cantorian theory of sets. So far, I have deliberately tried to defend Descartes from those who attack him as an enemy, but it is impossible to deny the fact that there was a confusion in Descartes himself which made his accusers almost inevitable. The problem concerns the discrimination between to doubt and to think. In Discourse on Method, Descartes reflects that the existence of the doubting subject cannot be denied after doubting everything else. But then, just after this, he quickly concludes with his famous, or infamous, I think, therefore, I am. Nonetheless, doubting and thinking, or the subject of doubt and the subject of thinking, must be different. Descartes posits thinking as the ground of all actions. But what, then, am I? A thing that thinks. What is a thing that thinks? That is to say, a thing that doubts, perceives, affirms, denies, wills, does not will, that imagines also, and which feels. Kant called this kind of thinking subject a transcendental subject of thought X. To Kant it is apperception that can never be represented, and for him Descartes' formulation that it is a fallacy. Cartesian cogito is dogged by the ambiguity between I doubt and I think. Furthermore, the ambiguity is inevitable as far as trying to speak of the transcendental ego is concerned. Descartes writes, for a long time I had noticed that, as for morals, it is sometimes necessary to follow opinions that one knows to be quite uncertain, all the same as if they were indubitable, as has been said above. But, because I then desired to devote myself solely to the search for the truth, I thought that it was necessary that I were to do completely the contrary, and that I were to reject, as absolutely false, all that in which I could imagine the least doubt, in order to see whether there would remain, after that, something in my beliefs that were entirely indubitable. I resolved to feign that all the things that had ever entered my mind were no more true than the illusions of my dreams. But, immediately afterward, I took note that, while I wanted thus to think that everything was false, it necessarily had to be that I, who was thinking this, were something, and noticing that this truth, I think, therefore I am, was so firm and so assured that all the most extravagant suppositions of the skeptics were not capable of shaking it, I judged that I could accept it, without scruple, as the first principle of the philosophy that I was seeking. Note the sudden jump that occurs between I doubt and I think. In Descartes, I doubt is a personal determination of will, and this I is a singular existence. Descartes himself, in a sense, is an empirical self, and is simultaneously the doubting subject, who doubts the empirical subject, by way of which the transcendental ego is discovered. In Descartes' discourse, however, the relationship between these three phases of the ego is blurred. When Descartes says, I am, if he means that his transcendental ego exists, it is a fallacy as Kant said, for the transcendental ego is something that can only be thought, but cannot be or exist, that is, it cannot be intuited. On the other hand, Spinoza interpreted I think, therefore I am as neither a syllogism nor a reasoning but as meaning simply, I am as I think or I am thinking, or, even more simply and definitively, man thinks. But, speaking more realistically, the Cartesian, I think, Therefore I am, means I am as I doubt. The determination to doubt the self-evidence of the psychological ego cannot simply originate from a psychological ego, but neither can it from the transcendental ego that is discovered by doubt. If this is so, however, what exists? Actually, as I will show later, the correct way of formulating the question is not, what exists but who is it? But this move requires a detour through Husserl. The question, what exists, was hardly irrelevant to Kant, for in the Transcendental Critique, the determination to bracket empirical self-evidence, or I criticize, is omnipresent. Kant notwithstanding the fact that Kant did not mention it, the ultimate importance of the discourse on method lies in the fact that it revealed another problem in the sum. How does the I who brackets all self-evidence exist? Though Descartes never touched upon it again after this particular text. On the other hand, Husserl criticized Kant to develop transcendental phenomenology by returning to Descartes. Accordingly, Husserl wrote, one might almost call transcendental phenomenology a neo-Cartesianism, even though it is obliged, and precisely by its radical development of Cartesian motifs, to reject nearly all the well-known doctrinal content of the Cartesian philosophy. 11 In the place of considering the transcendental ego as apperception, as had Kant, Husserl considered it, as had Descartes, to be a ground from which solid science can be deduced, and thought it imperative to develop this line more persistently and rigorously than had his predecessor. In this context, Husserl made a noteworthy point. We can describe the situation also on the following manner. If the ego, as naturally immersed in the world, experiencingly and otherwise, is called interested in the world, then the phenomenologically altered, and, as so altered, continually maintained, attitude consists in a splitting of the ego, in that the phenomenological ego established himself as disinterested onlooker, above the naively interested ego. That this takes place is then itself accessible by means of a new reflection, which, as transcendental, likewise demands the very same attitude of looking on disinterestedly, the ego's sole remaining interest being to see and to describe adequately what he sees, purely as seen, as what is seen and seen in such and such manner. Here Husserl not only distinguishes between psychological ego and phenomenological ego, but also points out the being of the I who further observes the splitting of the ego as an onlooker. This ego exists as a will to phenomenological reduction, which is, for Husserl, equivalent to the willing to forge philosophy into a science built on an absolutely solid ground. In the strict sense, therefore, it is insufficient to point out the existence of only two kinds of ego, psychological and transcendental. Husserl continues, obviously it can be said that, as an ego in the natural attitude, I am likewise and at all times a transcendental ego, but that I know about this only by executing phenomenological reduction. 13. Which is to say that there are three egos, the empirical ego, the ego who seeks to transcendentally reduce that ego, and the ego who is transcendentally discovered as a result. In this account, Husserl recovers the distinction between I doubt and I think that Descartes had blurred, namely, the distinction between the I who doubts and the transcendental subjectivity. Husserl attempts to constitute the world by the transcendental ego, including other egos, yet he does not consider the ego to be a substance, as had Descartes. The Husserlian transcendental ego is the intentional function of consciousness, which intervenes in the intentional object. With this formulation, Husserl thought he had given philosophy the right to constitute beings from consciousness. This is different from Fichte's earlier attempt, in the more immediate post-Kantian context, to constitute the world by the transcendental ego. For, in Husserl's case, the transcendental ego is sustained by the willing, itself an empirical consciousness, that discovers it by a transcendental change of attitude. But Husserl's new distinction confronts him with a serious paradox. The world is constituted by the transcendental ego, yet the I who wills to doubt everything belongs to the same world. As Husserl himself put it, this is precisely the difficulty, universal intersubjectivity, into which all objectivity, everything that exists at all, is resolved, can obviously be nothing other than mankind, and the latter is undeniably a component part of the world. How can a component part of the world, its human subjectivity, constitute the whole world, namely, constitute it as its intentional formation, one which has always already become what it is and continues to develop, formed by the universal interconnection of intentionally accomplishing subjectivity, while the latter, the subjects accomplishing in cooperation, are themselves only a partial formation within the total accomplishment. The subjective part of the world swallows up, so to speak, the whole world and thus itself too. What an absurdity! 14. Husserl believed that the paradox of human subjectivity, being a subject of the world at the same time as being an object in the world, was resolvable. He sought to do so by transforming it into a Kant new question: how I can have, beyond my individual self-consciousness, a general, a transcendental intersubjective consciousness. 15. However, this only leads to yet another aporia. Can the other egos be constituted by the ego? With respect to this question, Husserl first explained the constitution of the other ego by way of a self-transposition into obliquetzel, toward what appears as the object, because of its sense constitution occurs necessarily as an intentional modification of that ego of mine which is the first to be objectivated, or as an intentional modification of my primordial world, the other is phenomenologically a modification of myself. 16. After all, for Husserl, the other is no more than a modification of myself. He finds the alterity, being other, in the self-differentiation within the transcendental ego. There is no doubt that the otherness of the other is absent in this move. Everything occurs inside the transcendental ego. Within and by means of this ownness the transcendental ego constitutes, however, the objective world, as a universe of being that is other than himself, and constitutes, at the first level, the other in the mode, alter ego. 17. Husserl maintains that his solipsism is tentative, heuristic, and methodological, one which should be overcome by an association of monads, namely, intersubjectivity. But, as is already evident, the other whom Husserl sought to constitute cannot be deemed the veritable other in our transcritical context. Earlier I argued that Kant introduced the other in order to attain the universality of science. This otherness appears under the name thing in itself, or it is the otherness grasped by way of the passivity of sensibility. Husserl borrowed the term transcendental from Kant, but only in order to return to Descartes. Ignoring Kant, Husserl could not acknowledge the structures of Kant's architectonic, sensibility, understanding, and reason, thing in itself, phenomenon, and idea. If Kant's transcendental critique appeared to Husserl to be impure, it was precisely because it contained the heterology, the other's standpoint. Kant maintained that one can think of, but not intuit, the thing in itself, and that, if not for this discrimination, one would be entrapped by antinomy. Thus Husserl's paradox is just the same as what Kant meant by antinomy. For instance, there is nothing new in Husserl's argument that grasping the whole world, we are within it, or vice versa, being in the world, we grasp it, saying that we are nowhere but in this world, we are on the meta level of the world. Husserl encountered it at the end of his inquiries, but it is the problem he really should have confronted at the very outset. That is to say that being other should not be a conclusion, because it is that which motivates the transcendental critique from the first. It should be said that Husserlian phenomenology is ultimately a solipsism that has no way out. In his Speech and Phenomenon, Derrida rebuked Husserlian phenomenology as phonocentrism and Westcentrism, but the same critique cannot be applied to Kant. As I have said many times, his transcendental position is initiated by a pronounced parallax, that is, notably dogged by otherness. While Husserl saw his philosophical ground in the West since ancient Greece, Kant was a cosmopolitan. He neither traveled nor exiled himself like Descartes. He lectured mainly on geography and anthropology. He refused an invitation from Berlin University and remained in his hometown, Königsberg. In his case, this refusal to move assumed a kind of transposition. In passing, Descartes was not the kind of thinker that Husserl wanted to make of himself. According to Husserl, Descartes has sought to secure the validity of the transcendental ego's constitution of the world by way of God, instead of intersubjectivity. Before moving on to his existential proof of God, there are three kinds of proof in Descartes, two of which are the same as those put forth by Anselm of Canterbury and the Philosophia Scholastica. The one that is original to Descartes is expressed in the following passage from Discourse on Method, engaging in reflection thereupon that I doubted, and that, as a consequence, my being was not totally perfect, for I clearly saw that it is a greater perfection to know than to doubt. I decided to search for the source from which I had learned to think of something more perfect than I was, and I knew evidently that this had to be from some nature that were, in effect, more perfect. Descartes scrutinized this problem further in the third of his Meditations on the First Philosophy, in what might well be called a proof after the effect. This proof for the existence of God by no means belongs on the same level as the previous ones. Descartes had 92. Kant demonstrated the validity of the existence of res cogitans by the fact that the doubting self itself remains after doubting everything. In his proof of God's existence, he again invoked I doubt. The difference here, however, is that, instead of the transcendental cogito, a doubting singularity now appears. If so, what does this proof really indicate? Punning on Spinoza's interpretation of cogito, Descartes is saying that I am as I doubt, thanks to the existence of what makes me doubt. What compels Descartes' doubt is the temporal and spatial heterogeneity of discourses, and in being other to the community one belongs to, the heterogeneity, the difference, is not what one produces, and it is not that which is grasped from the vantage point of identity. When one says the multitude of cultural systems are different, for example, one tacitly takes for granted the existence of a common, objective world. To Descartes, however, the existence of the objective world had to be founded in the first place. Seen from this perspective, one recognized that what Descartes called God was the very difference that compelled him to doubt, namely, the otherness that can never be internalized. In the final analysis, and from the very beginning, what is hidden under doubting is the alterity, the otherness of the other. Pascal accused Descartes of wanting to do away with God, if possible, and if one really tries to do away with God, one should just restate God as the other, who is not transcendent and absolute, but relative. The crux of Cartesian doubt cogito is that it was constantly dogged by the other. This crucial problem of transcriticism was effectively lost after Descartes' meditations, which corresponded, in turn, to his own loss of being as doubting and its external mode of existence. And so it was that Lévi-Strauss, too, lost his anthropological cogito in his later years. Once he stated that his stance would be progressive toward his own culture and conservative toward the objective cultures. Finally, he ended up being conservative toward his own culture as well. 3.2 Transcendental and transversal. In der Verlust der natürlichen Selbstverständlichkeit, W. Blankenberg called schizophrenia a living phenomenological reduction. Phenomenologists methodologically bracket the self-evidence of the life world, that is, I exist and the objective world exists, based upon the premise that they can unbracket at any time they want. For schizophrenics, on the other hand, the self-evidence is always already lost. Schizophrenics know that they exist and the world exists, but they cannot sense it vividly. For them it is tremendously difficult to live the world of self-evidence, namely, to unbracket phenomenological reduction, and if, in contrast, phenomenologists can bracket and unbracket self-evidence at will, then by what means? Hume radically questioned the Cartesian ego cogito, arguing that there are multiple egos in one person's being, and that identical subjectivity as such exists only customarily, such as a republic or commonwealth, as an imaginary union of the is. In regard to this kind of skepticism, he expressed his feelings as follows: we have, therefore, no choice left but betwixt a false reason and none at all. For my part, I know not what ought to be done in the present case. I can only observe what is commonly done, which is, that this difficulty is seldom or never thought of, and even where it has once been present to the mind, is quickly forgot, and leaves but a small impression behind it. 19 But then he is quick to correct himself. But what have I here said? That reflections very refined and metaphysical have little or no influence upon us? This opinion I can scarce forbear retracting, and condemning from my present feeling and experience. The intense view of these manifold contradictions and imperfections in human reason has so wrought upon me, and heated my brain, that I am ready to reject all belief and reasoning, and can look upon no opinion even as more probable or likely than another. Where am I, or what? From what cause do I derive my existence? And to what condition shall I return? Whose favor shall I court? And whose anger must I dread? What beings surround me and on whom have I any influence? Or who have any influence on me? I am confounded with all these questions, and begin to fancy myself in the most deplorable condition imaginable, environed with the deepest darkness, and utterly deprived of the use of every member and faculty. Most fortunately it happens, that since reason is incapable of dispelling these clouds, nature herself suffices to that purpose, and cures me of this philosophical melancholy and delirium, either by relaxing this bent of mind, or by some avocation and lively impression of my senses, which obliterate all these chimeras. I dine, I play a game of backgammon, I converse, and am merry with my friends, and when after 3 or 4 hours' amusement, I would return to these speculations, they appear so cold, and strained, and ridiculous, that I cannot find in my heart to enter into them any further. Even after this correction, however, Hume continues to spell out his contradictory feelings about skepticism. It is just empty and frivolous. It results in self-destruction, and so on. These depictions tell us that, for Hume as for Descartes, to doubt was never merely some sort of intellectual puzzle. It induced in him an almost morbid state of mind. But then, after dining with friends and having other diversions, he manages, somehow, to regain the world of self-evidence. From the Kantian standpoint, what this transformative event points to, if negatively, is that the transcendental ego exists. The nature of Kantian apperception is that it is revealed as the lack of itself. In the reading of Heidegger, it is nothing as a being but exists as an ontological function. To Hume, practicing transcendental reduction by bracketing the world of self-evidence, and then coming back to the same world by unbracketing, could never be voluntary. If it is true that the only distinction between philosophers and psychotics is that the former can bracket and unbracket freely and the latter cannot, then David Hume definitely belongs to the latter group. If, however, Hume is not a psychotic, it would be wrong to define philosophers, not scholars of philosophy, of course, as free agents of bracketing. In a certain sense, they, too, are compelled to doubt the world of self-evidence. It seems that philosophers intentionally deplete the self-evidence of the world, but perhaps they do so because they have already lost self-evidence from the beginning. I am not trying to say that philosophers are close to or candidates for schizophrenia, but I am suggesting that the transcendental reduction in philosophy cannot merely be a methodology. Socrates attributed the commencement of his skepticism to the oracle of Apollo, while Descartes attributed his to a dream. But these two cases nevertheless indicate the same thing. Their doubts are not motivated simply by their spontaneous wills. Doubting is not a game we opt to play, but a produced, constructed experience. Doubting, in tandem with the subject that exists as doubting, ensues from realistically existing difference or otherness. Yet this subject is definitely different from the transcendental subject. In contrast to Descartes, Kant spoke little of it, save with respect to the criticizing self. Now, this is the path, the only one that remained, which I have pursued, and I flatter myself to have found on it the elimination of all the errors that had thus far set reason, as used independently of experience, at variance with itself. 21 The I spoken here is this I, namely, Immanuel Kant himself. This is neither a transcendental ego, nor an empirical ego, for this I is the one that doubts the empirical I, and, we shall see in a moment, it is the most crucial to the transcritical context. Unlike Descartes, however, Kant did not confuse the doubting I with the thinking I. A critique that assesses what our cognitive powers can accomplish a priori does not actually have a domain as regards objects, for it is not a doctrine. Its only task is to investigate whether and how our powers allow us to produce a doctrine. The realm of this critique extends to all the claims that these powers make. In order to place these powers within the boundaries of their rightful, the transcendental critique is distinct from the faculties discovered by it. It does not belong to any domain of the faculties. So where does the critique come from? From the topos on which Kant was standing, namely, the interstice between empiricism and rationalism. For Kant, empiricism and rationalism were not simply two scholastic doctrines. Between them he encountered the paradox between being in the world and being the subject who constitutes the world. The same paradox as the one with which Husserl was to struggle. Taken together, empiricism and rationalism struck Kant as a pronounced parallax. And, as I have already mentioned, this is where Kant's critique began. For him, the critique was inseparable from his being as criticizing, that is externalized, existence. In contrast to Descartes, Kant did not speak of I doubt. Consequently, the critical cogito after Descartes existed in certain thinkers, including Kant, who kept quiet about it, or even publicly negated it. The first major example is Spinoza, the first of Descartes' extensive critics. Descartes himself, in his later work, considered thinking, Kant and extension to be two substances, but, as he put it in Discourse on Method, if thinking is determined by grammar and customs, it is also just a machine in the broad sense. The crux of the Cartesian cogito existed only in the doubts. What if we are just made to think, while we believe we actively think? What if we are enframed by sham problems charged by language? For his part, Spinoza considered thinking and extension to be two aspects of one and the same substance. By this move, however, it is not that Spinoza negated the Cartesian cogito. Rather, He sought to recover its critical function. For Spinoza, God is equal to the world, and Descartes' free will and God, far from going beyond the world, are just representations produced within the world. In a sense different from Heidegger, Spinoza implied that humans are beings in the world nature and cannot transcend it. This was a critique of Cartesianism, but not, in the properly transcritical sense, a denial of being as doubting. In fact, though denying free will, Spinoza thought it possible that humans could be relatively liberated from the rule of passion by revealing the cause of being ruled. In other terms, Spinoza affirmed the freedom of will to cognize the world. Yet again, this will should not be spoken of positively, for it cannot be separated from the sum, being as doubting. Indeed, this is precisely his Ethica. Spinoza was himself a singular cogito who refused to belong to any community. His was an externalized existence. He was not a temporary refugee, like Descartes, but lived in the interstice of nowhere land, having been excommunicated not only from the Christian church but also from the Judaic synagogue, making the interstice difference itself his world. Spinoza literally lived ego sum dubitans. He never spoke of the cogito, except when he wrote of Descartes, which, however, does not contradict the fact that he himself existed as a cogito. The one and only substance for Spinoza, God-world, implies his transcendentalization of the space in between individual systems, and by this, Spinoza undermines all the grounds of self-evidence inherent in those systems. But our task here is to return Descartes' dubito to the empirical world from whence it originated, not to recuperate or recontextualize by Husserl's transcendental motive, or by so many philosophers, will to understand everything transparently. But return is not the same thing as a straightforward going back to the empirical world. Instead, we have to reconsider Descartes' sum, especially in the way it is coextensive with dubitans, that is, reconsider sum transcendentally. From this perspective, cogito sum reveals itself as being similar to, but also radically different from, the being of beings that Heidegger disclosed. Here is Heidegger's formulation of the problem. If the cogito sum is to serve as the point of departure for the existential analytic of Dasein, then it needs to be turned around, and furthermore its content needs new ontologico-phenomenal confirmation. The sum is then asserted first, and indeed in the sense that I am in a world. As such an entity, I am in the possibility of being towards various ways of comporting myself, namely, cogitations, as ways of being alongside entities within the world. Descartes, on the contrary, says that cogitanes are present at hand, and that in these an ego is present at hand too as a worldless res cogitans. Heidegger undeniably inverts the order of cogito and sum. In other words, his starting point is not cogito but being there as in being in the world. In this manner, Heidegger believed he had succeeded in overturning the thought initiated in the Cartesian ego. But while this might be a critique of Husserl, it is by no means a critique of either Descartes or Kant. Heidegger transfigured the Kantian distinction between the empirical and transcendental levels to that between the ontic and the ontological, and emphasized this shift as if it were his own invention. He also persisted in stressing the importance of the transcendental ego as nothing, namely, being, as opposed to the empirical egos of beings. But he never mentioned a word about the external beings who exist between communities. For this reason, his being there is at the same time a being with, which, for him, however, meant vogue. And here there is no margin or gap for the doubting cogito, the singular existence, ever to emerge. Still, if one dares to persist in using ontological terms, one could induce ontology from Cartesian doubt in the following manner. Cogito qua dubito is the awareness of the difference between systems, and sum is being in between them. What is really commonly concealed in philosophy is not the difference between beings and being, as Heidegger claimed, but the transcendental difference or, the interstice, the very thing Heidegger himself ended up concealing by his political ontology. And so it is also that Heidegger interpreted the Kantian transcendental critique exclusively along its vertical vector, to its depth. For me, by contrast, transcendental critique should be considered and practiced, at the same time, along its transversal vector, and I call this multidimensional oscillating engagement transcritique. Now, in criticizing Descartes, Heidegger returned to the pre-Socratics. To be kept always in mind here, however, is the fact that these thinkers were foreigners to Athens. Being in the Mediterranean space of intercourse, they thought in the interstices, or intermundia, to use Marx's favorite term from Epicurus. They did not depart from any polis as the self-evident premise of their thinking. Parmenides, for example, defied the gods, and Heraclitus rebuked community rituals. As Ortega y Gasset said, it was in them and not in Athens that this new type of individual was formed. 25 Although it was the center of politics and information, Athens was initially less developed with respect to thinking than were the margins of the Greek world. The people of the Athenian community, who were enjoying their politico-economic hegemony, suddenly experienced an inundation of the paradoxa of previously unknown thinkers. For a people as profoundly reactionary and intensely adherent to traditional beliefs, it was an extremely unsettling experience. 26. In this climate, Socrates occupied quite an ambiguous positionality, executed by Athenians as a dangerous thinker whose faith was informed by foreign elements. To his mind he was a genuine Athenian, faithful to the polis. Unlike foreigners, he did not charge for his teaching. Instead of purging foreign thought, by means of his dialogue, Socrates scrutinized and internalized it. In actuality, the dialogue itself is the very form that excludes the other heterogeneous as well as the thinker merchant. The fact that Socrates himself was excluded came to conceal his oppression of the other heterogeneous. In Plato, Socrates' execution assumes the same significance as that of Jesus' death for the Apostle Paul, which is to say that Plato dramatized Socrates' death, one of many contingent executions of the time, as a sacrifice for the whole community of the polis. We can never know who Socrates really was, but at least we know what Plato accomplished in Socrates' name, the way of excluding external thought by internalizing and detoxifying its radicality. In Plato's philosophy, just as in Hegel's, all anterior thoughts are superseded or elevated, stored, abolished. Plato's dialectics, established by the exclusion of otherness, were another monologue. So when Heidegger praises Parmenides and Heraclitus while attacking Plato, I cannot help but be skeptical about his intentions, as when he writes, Parmenides stood on the same ground as Heraclitus. Where indeed would we expect these two Greek thinkers, the inaugurators of all philosophy, to stand if not in the being of the essence? 27 What does the expression in the being of the essence mean? Heidegger's sophistic rhetoric and forced etymology blind us to a much more crucial matter, the fact that these philosophers stood in between communities. According to Heidegger, Heraclitus saw being as the gathering together of the conflicting, and Parmenides saw identity as the belonging together of antagonisms. 28. In the final analysis all that this really should mean, however, is that they thought in the world as a heterogeneous space of intermundial intercourse, rather than thinking in the space of a community gathered around a univocal set of rules. From the beginning, it is impossible for those within a community to be inaugurators of all philosophy. It was only by standing in between communities that Heraclitus was able to see being as the gathering together of the conflicting, and Parmenides to see identity as the belonging together of antagonisms. It is clear that this radical positionality was lost in the Platonic Socrates, who was firmly rooted in the community of Athens. Problematizing the loss of being, Heidegger may have attacked Plato as the instigator of this line of thinking, yet his own positionality was isomorphic to Plato's, excluding the heterogeneity of the thought that comes from the topos of trade, and internalizing the denuded skeleton of that thought. For Heidegger, in the end, the loss of being was equal to the loss of the German agrarian community. In our own context, if the term loss of being retains any significance at all, it should be as the loss of the topos as difference, the loss of the space of intercourse in the intermundia, and precisely this loss is the proper side of Transcritique 3.3 Singularity and Sociality. Kant drew a keen distinction between universality and generality, similar to the manner in which Spinoza had distinguished idea from concept. While generality can be abstracted from experience, universality cannot be attained if not for a certain leap. As I have been arguing all along, the condition for a certain cognition to be universal is not necessarily that it be based upon an a priori rule, but that it be exposed to the judgment of others who follow a different set of rules. Thus far, however, I have been speaking mainly of this condition spatially, which will now have to be dealt with temporally. What I particularly want to stress is this point: the veritable others whom we cannot anticipate are the ones who live in the future, or, more accurately, the future is truly the future only insofar as it is of the other. The future we can anticipate is not the veritable future. Thinking in this manner, it is clear that universality can never be grounded by public consensus, because the latter can be pertinent only to a single community, no matter how large. This does not mean, however, that we can abandon the concept public. Instead, our task is to change the very meaning of public, which is precisely what Kant did. In his response to the question, what is enlightenment? Kant answered that it is man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity. In the concrete, this means becoming a member not of a national community but of a cosmopolitan society. What is noteworthy about this formulation is that Kant shifted the significations of the public-private pair. The public use of man's reason must always be free, and it alone can bring about enlightenment among men. The private use of reason may quite often be very narrowly restricted, however, without undue hindrance to the progress of enlightenment. But by the public use of one's own reason I mean that use which anyone may make of it as a man of learning addressing the entire reading public. What I term the private use of reason is that which a person may make of it in a particular civil post or office with which he is entrusted. But in so far as this or that individual who acts as part of the machine also considers himself as a member of a complete commonwealth or even of cosmopolitan society, and thence a man of learning who may through his writings address a public in the truest sense of the word, he may indeed argue without harming the affairs in which he is employed for some of the time in a passive capacity. In common usage, public, as opposed to private, is uttered at the level of community or nation. But Kant considered the public in this sense to be the private domain in reverse. Here is another indispensable aspect of the Kantian turn. This turn exists not simply in the fact that Kant emphasized the precedence of the public domain, but in the fact that he radically transformed the meaning of public. Within a community, paradoxically, being public cosmopolitan appears to be rather individual. In a community, being individual is deemed being private, because it is against the shared public consensus. For Kant, however, being individual is equivalent to being public. In the cosmopolitan sense, communities and nation-states exist in reality, and so do international organizations centered on certain nation-states. But cosmopolitan society or world civil society in the Kantian sense does not exist in reality. People cannot be members of world civil society in the same sense that they belong to their communities. If not for an individual's will to be cosmopolitan or a world citizen, world civil society would not exist. Employing reason in regard to the world civil society necessitates consideration of the future other, even at the expense of any present public consensus. It is well known that Hegel negated such a stance as the spirit's abstract, subjective stage. For him, individuals become universal only as members of a nation-state. In order to avoid possible confusion and misunderstanding here, I would like to redefine several pairs of keywords. First, I stress the distinction between universality and generality. These two words are almost always confused, and the same is true of their opposing concepts, singularity and particularity. Gilles Deleuze drew a lucid distinction between universality and generality in difference and Kant. Repetition while touching upon Kierkegaardian repetition. Generality, as generality of the particular, thus stands opposed to repetition as universality of the singular. 30. His point is that while the connection between particularity and generality requires a mediation or a movement, that between singularity and universality is direct and unmediated, which is to say, sensu stricto, that while generality and individuality are mediated by particularity, the latter pair can never be mediated. Universality in the sense of Romanticism is the equivalent of generality in our context. For instance, while for Hegel individuality is connected to universality by way of particularity, for Kant there is no such mediation. What exists in between the terms is only incessant ethical determination. This latter way of being individual is precisely the way of being singular. Only the singular man can be universal. This is Kierkegaardian terminology, but it is implicit already in Kant. With respect to sensibility and understanding, Kant invoked what he called the schemas that which synthesizes these terms with imagination. Consider a triangle drawn on a piece of paper. The triangle could be arbitrary and of diverse shape, but we recognize any three lines connected to each other at their endpoints as a triangle in general. Because of the scheme, the individual and the general are synthesized. Later, Ernst Cassirer reformulated this idea as symbolic form. Just as earlier the Romantics had reconsidered mediation as the particular that synthesizes individuality and universality, Hegel formulated the problem as follows. The particular, because it is only the determined universal, is also an individual, and conversely the individual, because it is the determinate universal, is just as much a particular. 31. In other words, the particular includes in itself both the universal and the individual, and constitutes the middle term of the formal syllogism. What the Romantics then introduced, namely, the celebration of language, organicism, nation, and the like, can be seen logically as an orientation of particularity. And Georg Lukács criticized Kant for not overcoming the segregation between individuality and universality, between sensibility and understanding, following Hegel, who, for Transcritique him, went beyond Kant's distinction. Lukács accounts for particularity in the following way. Because in theoretical recognition the movement in both directions oscillates from one extreme to the other, and the middle, the particular, plays a mediating role in either case. In the case of artistic reflection, the middle becomes literally the center, the focal point, where the movements center themselves. Therefore, herein exist both a movement from particularity to universality as well as a movement from particularity towards singularity, whereas in both cases the movement towards particularity is the determinant one. Particularity now achieves a non-resolvable fixation, and upon this, the world of forms of artworks constructs itself. The mutual overturn and fusion of categories are changing. Singularity as well as universality appear always resolved in particularity, but it was not Hegel who had first proposed this recognition of particularity. It had been well nurtured by the Romantics. Already Johann Gottfried Herder's concept of language had entailed the particularity that synthesizes sensibility and understanding, individuality and universality, from the start. However, the syllogism linking individuality, particularity, universality was not necessarily developed as a property specific to language. For one thing, nation has always been considered the middle term between individuality and humanity. Furthermore, in between the natural and the spiritual, nature and freedom in Kant's terms, was posited organism as particularity. In fact, for Herder, language was always inseparable from the notion of nation qua organism. Wilhelm von Humboldt's idea that language is an organism was also derived from Herder. For the Romantics, the idea of nation came to be privileged because of a grounding logic according to which particularity synthesizes, even originates, individuality and universality. Within this logic, it is only particularity that assumes the concrete. This idea is most typically expressed in the famous words of Joseph Marie Comte de Maistre: "There is no such thing as man in the world. In the course of my life I have seen Frenchmen, Italians, Russians etc. I know, too, thanks to Montesquieu, that one can be a Persian. But as for man, I declare that I have never met him in my life. If he exists, he is unknown to me." 33. The individual becomes an individual person primarily within one's own national language. The universality of the human being, a human in general, is abstract and empty when the particularity is absent. Hence, the concept cosmopolitan has always been scorned, and still is. Yet, for his part, as we now know, Kant never thought of the world civil society as substance. He never denied that everyone always belongs to a certain community. He simply urged that individuals behave as cosmopolitans in thinking and action. In actuality, being cosmopolitan would be impossible were it not for the struggle of individuals within and against their own communities. In the history of philosophy, German Romanticism is customarily categorized as post-Kantian. After all, it was a movement that came after Kant, but individual thinkers such as Herder and Fichte were in fact Kant's contemporaries, and often criticized by him. Notably, Kant's world civil society was a concept coined as a critique of the Romantics' concept of nation. Although in Critique of Pure Reason, Kant seems to criticize the metaphysics of the past, his true and more crucial target was the metaphysical drive of reason, as it was being resuscitated in his own time in the form of the nation. Kant maintained that sensibility and understanding are synthesized by the power of imagination, which is to say that, from the reverse perspective, the synthesis is just imaginary. Inverting Lukács's view that Kant could not get beyond the dichotomous crack, we have seen that Kant deliberately rendered a crack in an imaginary synthesis that had long existed. This, to repeat, is the very crux of the Kantian transcendental critique. Now I return to the distinctions between individuality generality and singularity universality. In Kant's terminology, the former pair is empirical, while the latter is transcendental. The pair singularity universality reveals the fact that the synthesis by individuality generality is merely an imaginary construct. After Hegel, Kierkegaard and Max Stirner introduced the concept of singularity, each in his own manner. For Hegel, God is anthropomorphized in Christ because a human is already God, which, in Feuerbach's terms, is to say that individuals are originally beings of generic essence, or specious beings. It was in order to negate such an uncritical and dangerous synthesis that Kierkegaard invoked his own concept of singularity by seeking to introduce the circuit of singularity universality in opposition to the circuit of individuality generality. Singularity is often associated with existentialism, of course, but this is a simple-minded view. In much the same climate as Kierkegaard, Stirner posed the concept of the single man or single ego to criticize Feuerbach, who, despite his materialist overturning of Hegel, had remained within the Hegelian framework. For Stirner, this I is singular, containing no generic essence or specious being, refuting both the Hegelian Geist and the Feuerbachian Wesen as ghosts. Stirner advocated a form of communism as a free social association of single men or egos. In the German ideology, Marx and Engels attempted of course to make Stirner publicly risible, christening him Saint Max. But their earlier private correspondence clearly shows Stirner's importance as a protoform of communism. Extending this line of argument, for the Marxian turn to occur, what was required, far beyond any materialist overturning of Hegel, was also the circuit of singularity universality that severs the double circuit of individual genus and individuality generality. It was in the context of his critique of Feuerbach that Marx began to use the adjective social as a key concept. It goes without saying that Marx's social is employed in contrast to the traditional community, but more importantly, it is distinct from civil society. 2. In Capital, Marx stressed time and again that the economic exchange begins in the interstice between communities. He reserved the term social for the exchange between communities, which is quite distinct from the kinds of exchange based upon the reciprocities of division of labor and gift-giving within a community. It was when the trade with outside worlds was internalized within Gemeinschaft that Gesellschaft was formed. Nevertheless, the latter also came to share the aspects of a community that is shaped around a certain, same set of rules. The social relations in the true Marxian sense are the relations with others to which we are tied. Though typically without being conscious of the constraint, men do not therefore bring the products of their labor into relation with each other as values because they see these objects merely as the material integuments of homogeneous human labor. The reverse is true. By equating Kant their different products to each other in exchange as values, they equate their different kinds of labor as human labor. They do this without being aware of it. For classical economics, exchange value is internalized within individual commodities. But for Marx, as I have already begun to note, particularly the Marx of Capital, commodities do not have exchange value or even use value if they are not sold. If not, they are simply discarded. Marx called the jump of commodity into money the fatal leap of the commodity. When he speaks, then, of the sociality of the commodity or of the labor that produces it, he unequivocally refers to the fatal leap and the inevitable blindness of ours that accompanies it. The synthesis of the two aspects of commodity, use value and exchange value, is akin to Kierkegaard's synthesis of finite and infinite. Losing the relationship with the other, the unsold commodity is like the self desperately wanting to be himself. 37. In this sense, Marx's dialectics is not a simple overturning of Hegel but is instead closer to the Kierkegaardian qualitative dialectics. What is crucial to consider at this point is the fact that, radically inscribed in Marx's sociality, is the moment of singularity, notwithstanding the fact that he rejected Stirner's single ego and his own as quintessential bourgeois individualism. In his Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity, Richard Rorty categorizes thinkers from the past as two basic types: those who deal with individuality and those who deal with sociality. He puts Marx squarely in the latter group. However, as I have pointed out, things are not nearly so simple, not after having learned that for Marx sociality is inseparable from singularity. Rorty fails to distinguish community, a communication network among those who share the same set of rules, and society, communication between different systems. Singularity, as exemplified by the Cartesian cogito, is the way of existing in social space, hence it is far from being private or introverted, as has been long claimed. With the term social, Marx pointed to the way in which individuals belonging to different systems communities are connected by exchange without their being aware of it. This is same critical space Kant identified with his term world civil society. And it is the space of Transcritique. Yet we cannot speak directly of singularity. Why not? Because it is the nature of language to pull the circuit of singularity universality back to the circuit of individuality generality. No matter how precisely we may try to describe this thing or this I, the description can be no more than a specification of a general concept. We feel that this thing or this I is singular, but, As soon as we speak in the deictic, our discourse results in the limitation of general concept. Hegel criticizes the attitude to persist in the singularity that language cannot grasp. The I is merely universal like now, here, or this in general. I do indeed mean a single I, but I can no more say what I mean in the case of I than I can in the case of now and here. When I say this here, this now, or a single item, I am saying all thises, heres, and nows, all single items. Similarly, when I say I, this singular I say in general all is. By the same token, for Hegel, the universal is equal to the general. He continues, consequently, what is called the unutterable is nothing else than the untrue, the irrational, what is merely meant, if nothing more is said of something than that it is an actual thing, an external object. Its description is only the most abstract of generalities and in fact expresses its sameness with everything rather than its distinctiveness. When I say, a single thing, I am really saying what it is from a wholly universal point of view, for everything is a single thing, and likewise this thing is anything you like. If we describe it more exactly as this bit of paper, then I have only uttered the universal all the time. But if I want to help out language, which has the divine nature of directly reversing the meaning of what is said, of making it into something else, and thus not letting what is meant get into words at all, by pointing out this bit of paper, experience teaches me what the truth of sense certainty in fact is. I point it out as a here, which is here of other heres, or is in its own self a simple togetherness of many heres, i.e., it is a universal. What Hegel appears to be trying to say here is this, that the individuality of the here and now, inasmuch as it is expressed in language, already belongs to generality, that any individuality that is not generality is merely meant, and that even the ineffable is constituted by language. In other words, singularity exists only as a divine nature of language. The political implication of this statement is that Kant cosmopolites as well as world civil society are only imagined constructs from the point of view of nation-states, and the individuality that is contradictory to the public is merely meant as a phantasm. And in this precise manner, Hegel himself ended up caging the circuit of singularity universality, precisely the circuit Kant had once opened up, within the circuit of individuality generality. In the introduction to the Japanese translation of Why Does Language Matter to Philosophy? Ian Hacking argues that it was Hegel who considered language to be public property, as opposed to the Kant who, in Hacking's view, was trapped in the philosophy of subjectivity. This Hegel is said to have initiated an important shift of emphasis when he stated that language is a self-consciousness as being for theatre, and that language is an externalized substance. When one recognizes that language is external, public, and social, one at the same time experiences a radical shift also concerning ego and identity. Hacking also points out that it was J.G. Heyman, the friend and critic of Kant, who first conceived this idea. There is, however, a distinct vagueness both in Hacking's use of the term public and in his distinction between community and society. For this reason, Hacking cannot distinguish between Herder's and Hegel's accounts of language as being public and Wittgenstein's critique of private language. 42. The Kantian transcendental critique, as I have already said, was in actuality dealing with the matter of language, so it is wrong to assume that a new linguistic turn would clear away the problematic of ego, especially when the ego equals the doubting existence. In the problematic of language, there is a knotty obstacle that cannot be subsumed into the circuit of individuality generality, proper names. Since ancient times, philosophers have been struggling over individuality and generality. Realists maintain that substance exists as a general concept, whereas individuality is only its contingent appearance. For instance, a dog is a contingent appearance of the concept canis. Taking the opposite tack, nominalists hold that only the individual exists as substance, whereas generality is merely a concept attained from the former. On this view, the concept canis is an empirical abstraction from a multitude of dogs. Now, it is to be expected that realists think lightly of proper names, but, surprisingly, nominalists, too, dislike proper names, even though they do take into account that the individual qua substance is named by a proper name. This is because proper names are socially given and, after all, do not precisely indicate individuality. In Greece today, for instance, many men are still named Socrates. For this reason, nominalists came to neglect proper names on technical terms, for their being contingent and secondary. even though they considered them to be theoretically necessary. The last nominalist to presume the individual to be substance and yet still sought to abolish proper names was Bertrand Russell. He thought that proper names could be reduced to a bundle of descriptions. Following this logic, for instance, Mount Fuji can be transposed into the description, the highest mountain in Japan. Insisting that only deictic markers such as this and that can be a subject or substance, Lord Russell dubbed them logically proper names. For instance, with respect to the expression, X exists, and X is Mount Fuji, Russell considers X a proper name. But Russell's theory of description conflates singularity and individuality. Suppose there is a dog. On the axis of individuality, this dog is one of the genus Canis, and is defined by various characteristics, say, white, long-eared, sleek. Seen from the axis of singularity, however, this dog is no other than this dog, and irreplaceable by any other dog. The same is true with this I. I feel that this I is singular, which does not mean in the least that I am superior or extraordinary. Rather, in this case, this is not to be equated with, or reduced to, the this that indicates something, or something. One cannot describe this I or this dog, namely, this singularity. No description can grasp thisness, except to say that it accrues a bundle of descriptions or a bundle of sets. In contrast, this I or this dog qua singularity means no other than this, which is the same as saying, this is so in reality, though it could have been otherwise. For this reason, to tackle singularity I have to introduce the problematic of modality. Saul Kripke criticizes Russell by introducing the concept of modality into his theory of possible worlds. A possible world is something like a world that could exist if certain matters were different. Possible. Kant worlds are total ways the world might have been, or states or histories of the entire world. 43. But in our context, we have to be cautious about two things. First, that possible worlds are thought only from the vantage point of the existing real world or the world that has existed. And, second, that possible worlds are not worlds very far removed from this world. According to Russell, the proper name Mount Fuji can be transposed to the description the highest mountain in Japan. But let us imagine a world in which Mount Fuji is not the highest mountain in Japan. In this case, while we could say that Mount Fuji is not the highest mountain in Japan, we cannot say that the highest mountain in Japan is not the highest mountain in Japan. Thinking of the real world through possible worlds in this manner, the difference between proper names and definite descriptions becomes clear. Kripke calls the proper name a rigid designator because it is adequate to and in all possible worlds. He negates, most of all, the idea that the individual, no matter what it might designate, is no more than a set of characteristics. This is to say that the proper name is unrelated to the description of an individual's characteristics, but indicates instead the individuality of an individual in a direct way. Seen from our point of view, Kripke criticizes Russell for reducing the world with proper names to the circuit of generality individuality. To Kripke, even names of species, which are deemed general nouns, are ultimately proper names. In this one can see his design to reconsider natural science as natural history, contrary to Russell, who sought to reduce natural science to logic. In a different sense from Russell, Hegel, too, had reduced the history of philosophy into a logic without proper names. Proper names presuppose a singularity that cannot dissolve into generality. History itself is no longer history if not for proper names. But, at just this point, we have to approach the problematic with another of our concerns: society community. Kripke stresses that rigid designation by proper name cannot be a private matter. Naming is done by the community and by a chain of historical transmission. When Kripke uses the term community, however, the transmission must be, in a strict sense, the one that occurs between communities, that is, a social transmission. In fact, however, proper names can never be translated into other languages. Traveling through different languages as they do, they are the very indicators of social intercourse. The fact that linguists tend to omit proper names from their disciplines can be explained by the inherent untranslatability of proper names. This is not so much due to the fact that the proper name is the source of the misconception that language is connected directly to reference, but because the proper name prevents us from grasping language as an enclosed differential relational system. The proper name makes possible the rigid designation of a referent because it intervenes in manifold systems, and proper names exist at once within and without long. Hegel was correct in saying that singularity cannot be expressed in language, which does not mean, however, that it does not exist. It reveals itself to us only in a detoured manner. Language has a resistance that cannot be subsumed into the circuit of individuality generality, which appears in the paradox of proper names. It is in this instance that we find out in the negative way that singularity is concerned with the social. It is now clear why claims about language being public and social cannot lead immediately to the superseding of either Descartes or Kant. The enduring question is what the term public implies. Most important for us here is the distinction between the circuit of singularity universality, which opens itself to society, and the circuit of individuality generality, which belongs to community. Altering the definition of words does not solve real problems, but at least it can help avoid unnecessary confusion. When Marx stressed that people become individuals in society, he did so in order to seek beyond the binary opposition, individual-social, but the implication of a statement changes according to what society means. Should it mean community, then the individual would mean he who attempts to be universal, counter to community in his subjective fantasy. But should it mean society, the space between communities, it would imply that people become singular in universality. The proper name is also often associated with private property. For this reason, attacking the proper name appears to be anti-bourgeois. Kant. In the context of textual theory, it is argued that a text is appropriated by an author with a proper name, or is authorized by the name of the author. To take a seminal example, Roland Barthes insisted on denying authorship and on giving the text back to its imagined intertextual heterogeneity. But this move cannot be achieved by reducing a text to the world where there are no proper names, or a general structure. Rather, this entire argument should remind one of the fact that, when a text cannot be reduced to the being of an author due to the excess of signification, one has no option but to call the singularity of the excess by a certain proper name. Throughout this text, I have been using the name Kant, which however is not the author, neither is it the philosopher who has been appropriated by Germany or the West. The text of Kant is public to the world civil society, and it is this possibility that Transcritique calls Kant. 3.4 Nature and Freedom. I have waited to deal with Kantian ethics until now, the last chapter of the section, but I have been tacitly talking about it, especially via the problematic of the other, the transcendental position that began with the pronounced parallax between my stance and the other's stance persistently entails the problematic of alterity. In this sense, the transcendental attitude is thoroughly ethical. Speaking of ethics as a specific genre often blinds us to that aspect. For instance, art is customarily defined as a mediator between nature and freedom, namely, between scientific knowledge and morality. Yet scientific recognition involves as its premise both the activity of understanding that sets up hypotheses of the natural world and the existence of the others that would make the universality of the hypotheses possible. That is, it contains elements common to both art and morality. If so, what Kant thought with the terms freedom, nature, and the mediator do not aptly correspond to the officially existing objective domains of morality, scientific recognition, and art. His concepts were not confined to them, and such openness must also be true in such domains as history and economy that he did not write about as critique. In his book on Nietzsche, Deleuze said that what Nietzsche had sought to do was write the fourth critique that Kant had not completed. For that matter, what Marx sought to do in his critique of political economy would be another critique in the series. Now let me begin with Kant's theory of art. Pre-Kantian classicists thought that the essence of the aesthetic experience existed in the objective form, while post-Kantian romanticists maintained that it existed in subjective emotion. Though Kant is often deemed a predecessor of Romanticism, his thinking in fact operated in critical oscillation between Romanticism and Classicism, assuming the same transcritical stance that he took, in a different dimension, between empiricists and rationalists. He certainly did not compromise between the dichotomies or contexts. Instead, he questioned the ground that makes art art, in the same way that he questioned the ground that makes cognition cognition. A certain object is received as artwork only thanks to the operation of bracketing other interests projected onto the object, be it a natural object, a mechanical reproduction, or a daily utensil. The nature of the object in and of itself does not matter directly. Seeing an object by bracketing daily interests, or the change in attitude itself, makes the object an artwork. The common saying that Kant's aesthetics is subjective is correct to a certain extent, with the proviso that the Kantian subjectivity is totally different from the Romanticist one. Kant's subjectivity is the will to execute transcendental bracketing. It is for this reason that the Kantian critique is still suggestive while classicist and romanticist aesthetics became obsolete long ago. When Marcel Duchamp submitted the urinal on a pedestal, signed Armut and titled Fountain, to the exhibition of the Society of Independent Artists in New York in 1917, he questioned what makes art as a conceptual and institutional analysis. What he shed light on in this peculiar manner was very much one of the Kantian problematics, namely, to see things by bracketing daily interests. And another crucial point Kant proposed is of course that there is no universality in aesthetic judgment, though it is required. That is, when one considers a certain thing to be universal, it is always merely based upon historically engendered common sense. Kant, although these 2 points were made vis-à-vis aesthetic judgment and written as the third critique, they had already existed prior to his accounts on cognition and ethics. The above 2 points raised in the context of aesthetic experience persist in all domains, beyond aesthetic concerns. I said all domains, but for that matter, one of Kant's most crucial propositions is that domains themselves come into existence by way of transcendental reduction. On the one hand, Kant doubted the idea that an essence of art exists objectively, while on the other he questioned the idea that it exists only in subjectivity. Kantian subjectivity appears with this precise doubt, and it takes art out of the constant canonization of this or that school, and back to its arche, where certain experiences or objects are made into art. Kant is consistent in questioning the idea that the aesthetic domain, be it objective or subjective, exists in and of itself. Modern science was established by bracketing moral and aesthetic judgments. Only at this moment did the object appear, but this was not limited to natural science. Machiavelli came to be known as the father of modern political science precisely because he discovered the domain of politics by bracketing morality. Importantly, with the domain of morality the same can be said. The moral domain does not exist in and of itself. When we confront the world, we have at least 3 kinds of judgment at the same time: cognitive judgment of true or false, ethical judgment of good or bad, and aesthetic judgment of pleasure or displeasure. In real life, they are intermixed and hard to distinguish. Scientists make observations by bracketing ethical and aesthetic judgments. Only by this act can the objects of cognition come into existence. In aesthetic judgment, the aspects of true and false and good and bad are bracketed, only at the precise moment that artistic objects come into existence. These operations are emphatically not done naturally. Rather, one is always ordered to bracket by the external situation, and being accustomed to it, one forgets that one brackets, and think that the objects, scientific or artistic or moral, exist by themselves. Morality appears to exist objectively, at least that is the way we are taught, but the morality considered in this manner is unequivocally one that belongs to communities' codes. Therein moral norms are transcendent to individuals. Then comes another view of morals, conceptualized from the vantage point of an individual's happiness and profits. One might say that the former is rationalist, while the latter is empiricist, but both are heteronymous and not autonomous. Kant again intervenes to oscillate between them, and transcendentally questions what makes morals moral. In other words, he extracts a moral domain by bracketing a community's codes as well as personal emotion and interests. Kant maintains that the moral domain cannot be grounded by feelings of pleasure, displeasure, or by happiness, indicating that, from the beginning, Kant's moral world is attained by bracketing them. Just for the sake of confirmation, I would like to stress that this account is not to deny the fact that morality accompanies feelings of pleasure, displeasure, and it is not to say that morality itself opposes feelings. Bracketing is not the same as negation. Rather, Kant himself rebuked those stern moralists who sacrificed other dimensions for the sake of moral correctness. For Kant, morality is finally a matter of freedom rather than goodness or badness. If not for freedom, there is no good and bad. Freedom is synonymous to being kausasui, self-motivated, subjective, and autonomous. But, is there such a freedom? In Critique of Pure Reason, Kant proposes the following antinomy as the third conflict of the transcendental ideas. Thesis: the causality according to laws of nature is not the only one from which all the appearances of the world can be derived. It is also necessary to assume another causality through freedom in order to explain them. Antithesis: there is no freedom, but everything in the world happens solely in accordance with laws of nature. This antithesis should be read not from the standpoint of the causality of modern science, but of Spinozan determinism. According to Spinoza, everything in the world is determined necessarily, but the causality is so complicated that there is no other choice for us but to assume freedom and contingency. Kant approves this antithesis, namely, the fact that what we consider as a determination of free will is always already that by the complex of causalities. I am never free at the point of time in which I act. Indeed, even if I assume that my whole existence is independent from any alien cause, such as Kant, God, so that the determining grounds of my causality and even of my whole existence are not outside me, this would not in the least transform that natural necessity into freedom, for, at every point of time I still stand under the necessity of being determined to action by that which is not within my control, and the series of events infinite apart priori which I can only continue in accordance with a predetermined order would never begin of itself. It would be a continuous natural chain, and therefore my causality would never be freedom. On the other hand, however, he acknowledges elsewhere the thesis that speaks to the freedom of human acts, and says, in order to clarify the regulative principle of reason through an example of its empirical use, not in order to confirm it, one may take a voluntary action, e.g. a malicious lie, through which a person has brought about a certain confusion in society, and one may first investigate its moving causes, through which it arose, judging on that basis how the lie and its consequences could be imputed to the person. With this first intent one goes into the sources of the person's empirical character, seeking them in a bad upbringing, bad company, and also finding them in the wickedness of a natural temper insensitive to shame, partly in carelessness and thoughtlessness. In so doing one does not leave out of account the occasioning causes. In all this one proceeds as with any investigation in the series of determining causes for a given natural effect. Now even if one believes the action to be determined by these causes, one nonetheless blames the agent, and not on account of his unhappy natural temper, not on account of the circumstances influencing him, not even on account of the life he has led previously, for one presupposes that it can be entirely set aside how that life was constituted, and that the series of conditions that transpired might not have been, but rather that this deed could be regarded as entirely conditioned in regard to the previous state, as though with that act the agent has started a series of consequences entirely from himself. This blame is grounded on the law of reason, which regards reason as a cause that, regardless of all the empirical conditions just named, could have and ought to have determined the conduct of the person to be other than it is. What is noteworthy here is that Kant locates the freedom of action only ex post facto, not ex ante facto. There is no freedom as such ex ante facto. Kant's universal imperative of duty is, act as if the maxim of your action were to become by your will a universal law of nature. 52. This drew the criticism that Kant's ethics was subjectivist, and that it attached importance to the purity of motive of the moral act but ignored its result. One must not forget, however, that he sustained, at the same time, the antithesis, I am never free at the point of time in which I act. To repeat, he certainly said, act as if the maxim of your action were to become by your will a universal law of nature. But the fact of the matter is that the intention and the result of action are different things, as Wittgenstein said, and to think one is obeying the rule is not to obey a rule. 54. We do things differently from our intentions, and it is extremely rare that what we intend is actually realized. The most crucial point here is that of responsibility, the responsibility for the result. Only when we are considered free agents, though we are not at all in reality, do we become responsible. Kant's phrase, this deed could be regarded as entirely conditioned in regard to the previous state, as though with that act the agent has started a series of consequences entirely from himself, means just that. When we have done something wrong without knowing that it would be harmful, are we still responsible even if we did not know it? Those who have the potency to know that it was harmful are said to be responsible, while in the first conflict of transcendental ideas, the thesis, the world has a beginning in time and in space, it is also enclosed in boundaries, and antithesis, the world has no beginning and no bounds in space, but is infinite with regard to both time and space. 55, are both proven to be false by antinomy. In the third conflict of transcendental ideas, both thesis and antithesis can be established. Why? Because the thesis signifies the stance of seeing human action by bracketing natural causality, while the antithesis signifies the stance of seeing the causality of human action by bracketing people's assumption of freedom. As long as they are bracketing different domains, they can stand together. Let me call the former a practical stance, and the latter a theoretical stance. And, as evident now, the theoretical and practical domains do not exist in and of themselves. They exist only when one subjectively takes theoretical and practical stances. Critique of pure reason is aimed at refuting the metaphysical argumentations that seek to prove self, subject, and freedom as substance. On the other hand, critique of practical reason queries the ways by which self, subject, and freedom can exist in the phase where the necessity of nature is bracketed. In Kant reality, we can have various choices, and without knowing to what extent the choices are compelled by the necessity of nature. As a result, we come to acknowledge, to a certain degree, decisions determined by causality and, to a certain degree, those determined by free will. Suppose there is a criminal. There are many causes for his crime, personal as well as social. If one named every possible cause, it would turn out that he had no free subject, and thus no responsibility. Upset by such a defense and vindication, people would claim that he must have also had freedom of choice. Therefore, common sense would be to accept that humans are determined by various causalities, while acknowledging their free will. Kant, however, rejected this kind of middling solution. First, we should think that there is no such thing as free will. When we think we do something by our free will, we do so only because of our unawareness of its being determined by external causes. After realizing this, it is finally possible to ask how freedom is possible. From the beginning, neither freedom nor responsibility emerges out of the theoretical stance that queries the cause. According to Kant, the criminal's responsibility arises when the causality is bracketed, that is, when he is a free agent. In reality, he does not have freedom sensu stricto, but he has to be deemed free in order for him to be responsible. Such is the practical standpoint. Kant thought that freedom lay in the duty to obey. This is a tricky point where logic tends to falter, because obeying command seems to be the opposite of freedom. But it is clear that Kant did not identify duty with that which is imposed by the community's code. If the command of duty is of community, to obey it is a heteronymous act, and not free. In order to be free, then, what kind of command does one have to obey? That is no other than the command, be free. There is no contradiction here, neither is there any enigma in Kant's word. He can do something because he is aware that he ought to do it. 56, which simply means that freedom can spring only from the imperative of being free. Where does this imperative come from? It comes neither from community nor from God. It originates from Kant's transcendental attitude itself, that which entails the imperative. Bracket it. Returning to our mot. Duchamp is not commanding viewers to see the urinal as an artwork by bracketing their daily concerns. Instead, the context, being installed in an exhibition, is itself commanding viewers to see it as artwork, though most viewers are not aware of it. Likewise, the fact that the transcendental stance itself contains the imperative is forgotten, and finally the fact that the transcendental stance is spurred by an imperative is forgotten. Where does the transcendental stance spring from? It is spurred on by the existence of the others. In this sense, it can be said that the transcendental standpoint is ethical. This imperative, be free, ultimately contains the imperative to treat others as free agents. Kant's moral law is little more than the command, so act that you use humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. 57, and it is only thanks to the imperative that the personalities of the others come into existence. Within the theoretical stance, neither my personality nor that of any other can exist. Only in the practical domain do they appear. Thus Kant's laws of morality are synonymous to being practical. Now, to interpret the causality of the necessity of nature from a wider perspective. Remember that the causes of the criminal case come not only from personal feelings but also from social relations. If so, then, how can we assess those social relations? Marx wrote about this with respect to his methodological stance in Capital. To prevent possible misunderstanding, let me say this: I do not by any means depict the capitalist and the landowner in rosy colors, but individuals are dealt with here only insofar as they are the personifications of economic categories, the bearers of particular class relations and interests. My standpoint, from which the development of the economic formation of society is viewed as a process of natural history, can less than any other make the individual responsible for relations whose creature he remains, socially speaking, however much he may subjectively raise himself above them. This stance insists on seeing the social structure as a necessity of nature, thereby forestalling any attribution of responsibility. But I contend that Marx attained this gaze from the natural historical stance, namely, by bracketing responsibility. When he saw social, Kant relations as a natural historical process, it could be said, He took a theoretical position, with which to execute the bracketing of subjectivity and responsibility, but not to negate them. Marx could have spoken moralistically like Proudhon, who insisted, la propriété, c'est l'éval, but he did not. The Marx in Capital persisted in the bracketing, and this was driven by his ethical will. If so, there is no need of searching for Marxian ethics outside Capital. For his part, Kant's ethics cannot be sought only in his accounts of morality, being theoretical at the same time as being practical. The transcendental stance is itself ethical. I now take up the three main currents of thinking in post-war France: existentialism, structuralism, and post-structuralism. The existentialist, Jean-Paul Sartre, stressed freedom, while admitting the structural determinedness of humans. His vantage point might be defined as practical. On the other hand, when the structuralists questioned the concept of subject as a substance and saw it merely as an effect of structure, they took a theoretical stance. In this context, it is quite understandable that they returned to Spinoza. As I mentioned earlier, the thesis of Kant's third antinomy results in Spinoza's position, that everything is determined by causes, but people think they act freely because the causes are so complex. Free will as well as anthropomorphized God, things that supposedly go beyond the necessity of nature, are imaginary constructs that are themselves determined naturally and socially. In fact, what one calls causes are retrospective constructs of the effects. Louis Althusser coined the concepts of structural causality and overdetermination in reference to Spinoza, and they, too, are a kind of determinism in a broad sense. One should not be overly excited by these theoretical achievements. They are nothing but shifts of stance that occur because of the bracketing operation that is inherent in the theoretical stance. There is nothing new about the series of problematics that was presented in the dichotomy of existentialism versus structuralism or subject versus structure. It is little more than a variation of what Kant presented as the third antinomy. It is meaningless to oppose subject against the structuralist stance, or to seek the subject therein, because, from the beginning, it is only by bracketing the subject that structural determinism is attained. Conversely, only when structural determination is bracketed can the dimension of subject and responsibility return. Later, when post-structuralism sought to reintroduce morality, it was simply as a matter of course. So in this sense, none of them was necessarily new. Being swayed by a spectacular succession of new trends, one tends to overlook the aspect that they were alterations of theoretical and practical stances. Meanwhile, the lesson of the Kantian transcendental critique is to keep both stances at the same time. One has to know how to bracket and unbracket at the same time. In Critique of Practical Reason, Kant's harshest target was eudaimonism. He rejected it because happiness is governed by physical causes, namely, because it is heteronymous. Freedom, on the other hand, is metaphysical. Kant's reconstruction of metaphysics is nothing if not involving this. But eudaimonism was not the only thing Kant considered heteronymous, so was the morality that belongs to the community. In Encyclopedia Logic, Hegel first praised Kant for having criticized eudaimonism, but then quickly criticized him for remaining in individualism. What was dominant at that time was the conventional moralism imposed by family, community, and church, and eudaimonism of English origin was rather accused of endangering this kind of moralism. Along this line, Hegel acknowledged Kant's critique of eudaimonism, but attacked him by advocating the primacy of objective ethics. The intention was to recover the authority of family, community, and nation-state. Against such a position, Kant would rather support eudaimonism. From eudaimonism, however, one can never induce universal moral law. The principle of happiness can indeed furnish maxims, but never such as would be fit for laws of the will, even if universal happiness were made the object. 4. Because cognition of this rests on sheer data of experience, each judgment about it depending very much upon the opinion of each, which is itself very changeable. It can indeed give general rules but never universal rules. We must pay attention to this distinction between general and universal. Kant did not extract moral law from existing various morals. He certainly formalized morality, but not in order to extract, Kant, the general of morals. For him, the moral domain exists only in the imperative, be free. What the moral law is telling us is nothing other than to be free and to treat others as free agents. As I have mentioned before, that Kant saw freedom in obeying duty caused many misunderstandings. It is easily mistaken for obeying the duties imposed by community and nation-state. Nonetheless, Kant's point was to grasp morality not in good and evil but in freedom. In the dimension where we are mainly tossed about by natural social causalities, There is no good and evil. In actuality, there is nothing like freedom sensu stricto. All acts are determined by causes. Yet if freedom as such intervenes at all, it is only at the moment when we consider ourselves as the cause of all of our acts. The imperative be free is equal to the imperative of bracketing natural causes. Nietzsche, who accused Kant of dividing the world between phenomenon and thing in itself, stated as follows: "My new path to a yes, philosophy, as I have hitherto understood and lived it, is a voluntary quest for even the most detested and notorious sides of existence. From the long experience I gained from such a wandering through ice and wilderness, I learned to view differently all that had hitherto philosophized. The hidden history of philosophy, the psychology of its great names, came to light for me. How much truth can a spirit endure? How much truth does a spirit dare? This became for me the real standard of value. Error is cowardice. Every achievement of knowledge is a consequence of courage, of severity toward oneself, of cleanliness toward oneself. Such an experimental philosophy as I live anticipates experimentally even the possibilities of the most fundamental nihilism, but this does not mean that it must halt at a negation, a will to negation. It wants rather to cross over to the opposite of this, to a Dionysian affirmation of the world as it is, without subtraction, exception, or selection. It wants the eternal circulation, the same things, the same logic and illogic of entanglements, the highest state a philosopher can attain, to stand in a Dionysian relationship to existence. My formula for this is amorphity. On the genealogy of morals and beyond good and evil, Nietzsche rebuked morals as the resentment of the weak. We must be careful to interpret the word weak, however, in the most straightforward interpretation. Nietzsche himself, who failed as a scholar and suffered from syphilis, was nothing but the weak. But the case is not so simple. To him, the strong or the Uberman is the one who accepts such a miserable life as one's own creation in the place of attributing it to someone else or to given conditions. That is his formula of amor fati. The Uberman is not an exceptional human, and amor fati is the stance to accept one's destiny determined by external causes as if it were derivative of one's free will. In Kantian terms, this is a practical stance par excellence. Nietzsche scrutinized the way of being a free subject in the practical sense. His thoughts have nothing to do with affirmation of the status quo, and his will to power is attained by bracketing the determination of causality. Nevertheless, what he forgot was the need to see the world by unbracketing it now and then. That is, while attacking the resentment of the weak, Nietzsche did not dare to see the real relations that necessarily produce it. He ignored the view that individuals are finally the products of social relations, no matter how much they think they are beyond them. Theodor Adorno read Kant's moral imperative as a social norm and criticized this point in reference to Freud. According to Adorno, Kant excluded the genetic moment from moral philosophy, and in recompense, attributed to it a noumenal characteristic. No Kant interpretation that would object to his formalism and undertake to have the substance demonstrate the empirical moral relativity which Kant eliminated with the help of that formalism. No such interpretation would reach far enough. The law, even in its most abstract form, has come to be. Its painful abstractness is sedimented substance, dominion reduced to its normal form of identity. Psychology has now concretely caught up with something which in Kant's day was not known as yet, and to which he therefore did not need to pay specific attention, with the empirical genesis of what, unanalyzed, was glorified by him as timelessly intelligible. The Freudian school in its heroic period, agreeing on this point with the other Kant, the Kant of the Enlightenment, used to call for ruthless criticism of the superego as something truly heterogeneous and alien to the ego. The superego was recognized, then, as blindly, unconsciously internalized social coercion. This interpretation is a typical misreading, for Freud himself, after Beyond the Pleasure Principle, amended his idea of the superego, while he did not deny, in principle, his previous stance that superego was, Kant rooted in the social norm. At the same time, he came to conceive that superego was formed by an introversion of the death drive or aggression drive. Here Freud assumed an autonomy, namely, the superego that derives from the destructive drive controls the destructive drive itself. And, as Freud himself had to admit, the death drive is a metaphysical concept, but isn't Adorno himself, in the following passage, metaphysical? Perennial suffering has as much right to expression as a tortured man has to scream. Hence it may have been wrong to say that after Auschwitz you could no longer write poems, but it is not wrong to raise the less cultural question whether after Auschwitz you can go on living, especially whether one who escaped by accident, one who by rights should have been killed, may go on living. His mere survival calls for the coldness, the basic principle of bourgeois subjectivity, without which there could have been no Auschwitz. This is the drastic guilt of him who was spared. By way of atonement he will be plagued by dreams such as that he is no longer living at all, that he was sent to the ovens in 1944 and his whole existence since has been imaginary, an emanation of the insane wish of a man killed 20 years earlier. Karl Jaspers would call this metaphysical guilt in contrast to moral guilt. 66. That is to say that while moral responsibility is generated in committing certain vices, metaphysical responsibility could arrive without committing anything. But if Adorno and Jasper had thought they went beyond Kant's theory of morality by these accounts, they would have been wrong. To Kant, morality is consistently metaphysical, and in contrast, the morality of a community is physical. Therefore, Adorno's statement above actually crossed the point where Kant conceptualized his morality. I said earlier that, in Kant, the moral domain comes into existence only after the imperative be free. But, who is doing the commanding? Not the community, not the nation-state, not the religion, neither is it from the inside. It must come from outside. Jacques Derrida reflected upon responsibility from the vantage point of respondability. Responsibility appears only as a response to the other. The necessity to respond to others pushes us into the dimension of freedom. In the case of Adorno, it is a response to those who died in Auschwitz, those whose thoughts are nevertheless never knowable. In reality he had no guilt. He himself was a victim. Adorno felt responsibility toward the dead, however, because he felt he survived on the shoulders of the dead. This responsibility is the kind that comes into existence only when, in the terms of Kant, one follows the imperative, so act that you use humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. Adorno's feeling of responsibility toward the dead appears to have come from inside, but after all, it comes from outside, that is, the other. When one says the other, it does not have to mean existing others. The others, those who do not share a common set of rules, are not only those in outside communities, but also include those who do not exist in the here and now, future humans as well as the dead. Rather, with respect to otherness, they should be the model. Generally speaking, ethics takes only living beings in consideration, while Kantian ethics, that sees the others as the thing in itself, takes hold of the others who have been and who will be. Anglo-American philosophy negated the Kantian position and sought to construct ethics by returning to utilitarian concerns. On the other hand, Jürgen Habermas conceived that Kantian ethics could be surpassed by public consensus or intersubjectivity. Both of them limit their definition of the others to those who are present here and now, or worse still, to those who share the same set of rules. The dead, those who lived in the past, as well as the yet to born, those who will live in the future, are out of their range of concern. Today, those ethicists who have negated the Kantian position and proposed utilitarian moral law are increasingly facing an aporia vis-à-vis environmental problems. Take, for instance, the tremendous amount of industrial waste produced for the sake of our comfortable lives that will be charged to future generations. A public consensus among adults living today might be established, albeit restricted to advanced Western and non-Western nations, while dialogue and consensus with future people are impossible. Also impossible is communication with past people. They won't say anything. Why, then, does one feel responsible to them? Kant. This sense of responsibility is different from the residue of duties called to community that has endured since the primitive stage of human history. It appears only in correspondence to the imperatives be free, and treat others as free agents. Notwithstanding that Kant called this the inner moral law, it does not exist internally. It exists vis-à-vis the others who cannot be internalized. One must note that Kantian others are always posited in asymmetric relationships, and they are distinct from Hegel's and Sartre's another self-consciousness, namely, those who share the same set of rules and desires. The others are rather uninterested in me. When speaking of the others, people call to mind only those others living today, but the otherness of the other appears most strikingly in the dead. Thus, in Kierkegaard, the most frightful of all is that one dead gives no hint at all. Beware, therefore, of the dead. Beware of his cunning. Beware of his definiteness. Beware of his strength. Beware of his pride. But if you love him, then remember him lovingly, and learn from him, precisely as one who is dead. Learn the kindness in thought, the definiteness in expression, the strength in unchangeableness, the pride in life which you would not be able to learn as well from any human being, even the most gifted. One who is dead does not change. There is not the slightest possibility of excuse by putting the blame on him. He is faithful. Yes, it is true. But he is nothing actual, and therefore he does nothing, nothing at all, to hold on to you, except that he is unchanged. If, then, a change takes place between one living and one dead, it is very clear that it must be the one living who has changed. One cannot project one's empathy onto the dead, neither can one represent their will. They never talk, they never show their interest. Those who speak for the sake of the dead are just speaking for themselves. Those who mourn for the dead do it in order to forget them. By mourning, the dead won't change. It is we who change. By not changing at all, they reveal our changes. Thus they are cunning. They are the others in this very sense. Seeing the others as the thing in itself, as Kant did, is equal to seeing the others as someone from whom one can never evoke mutual consent, onto whom one can never project a representation, and of whom one can never speak as a representative. They are, however, different from Levinas's absolute other. They are the relative others who are around one every day. What is absolute is not the others themselves but our relationship with the relative others. I have pointed out that the inclination toward universality in Kant's epistemology and aesthetics premises the future other. In the same way, in order for moral law to be universal, not only does it have to be formal, but it also has to presume the future other, and in the final analysis, the future other implies the past other, the dead, because for the future other, one is dead. One must not forget one's destined position in history. In this precise sense, the Kantian critique essentially involves the problematic of history. At the end of his career, Kant began to tackle the problems of history head-on, yet this was not a change of attitude, because his stance, both theoretical and practical, persisted. Theoretically speaking, history has no end, it has only a complex of causality, but, from the beginning, the meaning and end of history do not exist in the same dimension as theoretical scrutiny. They are practical problems par excellence. Kant approached history with the same stance as the one he took in Critique of Judgment. Although there is no end in natural history, a certain finality may be presumed. Although there is no end in human history, it can be seen as if it had a finality. According to him, we should be content with providence and with the course of human affairs as a whole, which does not begin with good and then proceed to evil, but develops gradually from the worse to the better, and each individual is for his own part called upon by nature itself to contribute towards this progress to the best of his ability. 69. It is easy to refute this teleological position theoretically. Being theoretical is equal to seeing things by bracketing ends. In the first place, Kant himself considered such an idea of history as transcendental illusion. What is more important, however, is that Kant located a puzzle in the relationship between generations, that which appears to assume an end in human history. Yet nature does not seem to have been concerned with seeing that man should live agreeably, but with seeing that he should work his way onwards. Kant to make himself by his own conduct worthy of life and well-being. What remains disconcerting about all this is firstly, that the earlier generations seem to perform their laborious tasks only for the sake of the later ones, so as to prepare for them a further stage from which they can raise still higher the structure intended by nature, and secondly, that only the later generations will in fact have the good fortune to inhabit the building on which a whole series of their forefathers had worked without themselves being able to share in the happiness they were preparing. But no matter how puzzling this may be, it will appear as necessary as it is puzzling if we simply assume that one animal species was intended to have reason, and that, as a class of rational beings who are mortal as individuals but immortal as a species, it was still meant to develop its capacities completely. That one cannot share in the happiness preparing implies that even though an individual intends to struggle and die for future generations will neither acknowledge nor thank that individual for such sacrifice. One does the same vis-a-vis one's ancestors. Of course, within communities and nation-states, certain people are thanked and praised emblematically after their deaths, but community worship is another story entirely. As Walter Benjamin claimed, history belongs to the victors, but most of one's efforts will be ignored by the future others. What Kant stressed was precisely that we have to endure this disconcerting absurdity. For whatever we do for the future others, our acts are motivated by our own problems, for freedom has nothing to do with happiness. Freedom is not the same as the negation of happiness. Yet the imperative be free is often cruel. Kant's theory of morals is historical in essence because, as I have tried to show, it implicates the requirement that the moral law be realized historically. So act that you use humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end. never merely as a means. At the same time, however, he never ignored the natural historical process. As Hermann Cohen once reminded us, it is important that Kant stressed here never merely as. 72 With this, Kant also took as a premise the production and the relation of production, the domain that Marx scrutinized in Capital. To Kant, the use of others' humanity as a means was already an inevitability in the production and the relation of production in the commodity economy. Any account of human relations that overlooks this concern is merely a monastery or dormitory daydream, from the hotbeds of those who use the humanity of the faithful and parents merely as a means. Kantian ethics tends to be degraded only because it is read as if speaking to an end but not means in the place of an end, never merely as a means. The kingdom of the end exists upon a material and economic basis, and the personalism, when the base matters are not taken into consideration, cannot help but becoming a priestly sermon. Taking this aspect of Kant into consideration, Cohen called him the true originator of German socialism. 73. Communist society, for that matter, must be a society where others are treated as an end at the same time as a means, and communism is possible only by reorganizing the social system where people are treated merely as a means. In other words, here apodictically arrives the regulative idea of superseding capitalism. The dominant trend in contemporary ethics is the utilitarianism rebuked by Kant. This considers good as if it were calculable like interest. Along this line, ethics is reduced to economics, not to mention that it was coined from the standpoint of capitalist development. As opposed to this tendency, John Rawls insisted on social justice by invoking Kant. His idea was to dissolve social inequality by redistributing wealth relying on cumulative taxation. This was the same as the idea of a welfare society or social democracy. It lacked motivation toward a society where others are treated as an end at the same time as a means. But something happened in the 1980s when he began to pose Kantian constructivism. He began to advocate the democratic system of possessions as an alternative to capitalism. His idea of liberal socialism is no longer identical to the social democracy based upon the redistribution of wealth within the confinement of capitalism. His idea of the 1980s is very close to communism qua associationism in the sense of Proudhon and Marx, though his idea still lacks practical orientation. The fact that he came to pose this idea is an encouraging example, inasmuch as one thinks about ethics not from the vantage point of good, bad and happiness interest but Kantian freedom. It is apodictic to induce communism qua associationism. If so, how could the communists of the mid-19th Kant century be unconcerned with Kantian ethics? From its fountainhead, communism was an ethico-economic problematic. Marx's communism cannot be considered merely as a necessity of natural history, but also as an ethical intervention. Young Marx wrote about the categorical imperative of communism. The criticism of religion ends with the teaching that man is the highest being for man, hence with the categorical imperative to overthrow all relations in which man is a debased, enslaved, forsaken, despicable being. 74. This drew a response from Ernst Bloch, who had criticized the Marburg School as a Kantian revisionism of Marxian doctrine and still stressed as follows: this material categorical imperative is by no means, as alleged by the bisectors of Marx, confined to the young Marx. No part of it was suppressed when Marx transferred what he had formerly termed real humanism into the materialist philosophy of history. 75. It must be said that lurking behind this categorical imperative is a thread of Kantian thinking. Communism as practice is neither merely economic nor merely moral. To adapt Kant's rhetoric, communism without economic basis is empty, while communism without moral basis is blind. Greek letter Pi Marx. This page intentionally left blank for transposition and critique. 4.1 Transposition. Marx left a massive amount of work, but fragmentary as it is impossible to induce Marx's philosophy or political economy or communism out of the corpus.